The flickering neon sign of the 3rd Precinct cast a sickly yellow glow on the rain-slicked streets of Modesto. Inside, the air hung thick with the stale scent of coffee and desperation. Years bled into one another, marked by the rhythmic tap-tap-tapping of keyboards, the harsh ring of telephones, and the muffled cries echoing from the interrogation rooms. Mark Callahan leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips as he watched Brian Stokes toy with a young man brought in on suspicion of drug possession. "You know the drill, kid," Stokes' voice boomed, laced with a casual cruelty that had become his trademark. "Empty your pockets." Nice and slow, Mark watched the kid's hands tremble, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Another lamb to the slaughter, he thought, a flicker of amusement dancing in his eyes. He'd seen this scene play out countless times, each one solidifying his belief in their invincibility. They can scream, they can cry, they can swear their innocence till they're blue in the face, but who are they going to believe? Them or us? The thought resonated with a chilling certainty. The system was their playground, the rules bent to their will. They were the gatekeepers, the arbiters of justice, and they held all the cards. Brian slammed his fist on the table, making the kid jump. "I said empty your pockets." He enjoyed the fear, the raw, visceral display of vulnerability. It was a power trip, a reminder of his dominance. Outside the interrogation room, the precinct hummed with the low thrum of routine. Reports were filed, evidence was conveniently misplaced, and stories were carefully crafted to fit the narrative they dictated. It was a well-oiled machine, greased by years of unspoken agreements and carefully cultivated blind eyes. One incident blurred into the next, faces and names fading into a sea of forgotten injustices. Until Alicia Pearson. Alicia Pearson. The name grated on Mark's nerves like sandpaper. He remembered the night her brother, Dorian, was brought in. A routine stop, they claimed. Resisting arrest, their report stated. Mark remembered the sickening thud of Dorian's body hitting the pavement, the way his eyes had fluttered closed. He remembered the icy grip of unease that had momentarily clenched his gut before being replaced by the familiar, cold calculation of self-preservation. Just another statistic. That's what he told himself. But Alicia refused to let it be just another statistic. She haunted the precinct, a constant, unwelcome reminder of the cracks in their carefully constructed facade. Her persistence was an irritant, a buzzing fly they couldn't swat away. Her grief was a tangible presence in the sterile air of the precinct, a silent accusation that echoed in the empty hallways. The courtroom felt suffocating, the air thick with anticipation. Mark straightened his tie, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that surprised him. He'd faced down judges and juries before, his arrogance a shield against any flicker of doubt. But today was different. Today, Celeste Jameson stood across from him, her gaze sharp and unwavering. He'd heard whispers about her, a prodigal daughter returning to Modesto, a lawyer with a reputation for dismantling corrupt systems brick by agonizing brick. He'd scoffed at the rumors, dismissing her as another idealistic crusader destined to be swallowed by the machine. But as she began to speak, a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. Her voice, clear and resonant, cut through the hushed courtroom, each word a precisely aimed dart. She laid out the evidence with meticulous detail, painting a damning picture of their years of unchecked power. Body camera footage, miraculously recovered, showed the brutal reality of their encounters with Dorian Pearson. Internal memos, painstakingly obtained, exposed the systemic cover-up, the network of complicity that protected them. Brian shifted uncomfortably beside him, his usual swagger replaced by nervous fidgeting. Stay calm, Mark thought, willing himself to project an air of unflappable confidence. She's bluffing. She can't touch us. But even as he thought the words, a cold dread seeped into his bones. Celeste called Renee Alston to the stand. Renee, a patrol officer he'd worked with for years, a woman he'd considered an ally. He watched, his breath catching in his throat, as she recounted instances of misconduct she'd witnessed, incidents she'd been pressured to ignore. He could feel Brian's eyes boring into him, a mixture of anger and fear reflected in their depths. The carefully constructed wall of silence was crumbling, brick by agonizing brick. Then came Luis Benvidas, another officer who had filed internal complaints, only to be met with retaliation and threats. His testimony further solidified the pattern of abuse and the systemic efforts to silence dissent. Mark's carefully crafted facade began to crack, revealing the fear that gnawed at him beneath the surface. The final blow came with the unexpected appearance of Kendrick Solomon, a name Mark hadn't heard in years, a face he thought he'd successfully erased from his memory. Kendrick, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and righteous anger, recounted his own harrowing encounter with the detectives. He spoke of the night they planted drugs on him, the beatings, the threats. His words hung heavy in the air, a testament to the enduring power of trauma. Mark's carefully constructed world imploded. He could feel the weight of the judge's gaze, heavy with disapproval. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, filled with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. The arrogance that had once been his shield now felt like a heavy chain, dragging him down. Brian's face was pale, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The silence in the courtroom was deafening, broken only by the quiet sobs of Alicia Pearson. In that moment, Mark knew it was over. The game was up. The system they had manipulated for so long had finally turned on them. The fear he'd suppressed for so long surged to the surface, cold and suffocating. He glanced at Brian, a silent plea for help reflected in his eyes. But Brian just stared straight ahead, his face a mask of despair. They were alone, adrift in a sea of their own making. The reign of impunity was over. The precinct air hung thick, a miasma of stale coffee and the metallic tang of fear. Mark Callahan could taste it, a bitter film coating the back of his throat. He adjusted his tie, the knot suddenly too tight, a noose of his own making. Across the room, Brian Stokes stared blankly at the wall, his usual swagger replaced by an unsettling stillness. Mark watched him, a flicker of resentment igniting within the fear. Stokes was always the loud one, the brash one, the one who drew the attention. Now, in the silence of their shared predicament, his silence felt like a betrayal. "Damn woman," Stokes finally muttered, his voice a low growl. Where'd she even come from? Mark's thoughts echoed the sentiment. This Celeste Jameson, a name he hadn't known a week ago, now a constant, throbbing pressure in his skull. He remembered the first time he'd seen her in the courtroom, a figure of quiet intensity. He'd scoffed internally, mistaking her composure for inexperience. He'd been wrong, so very wrong. News of the initial complaint had barely registered. Just another disgruntled citizen, easily dismissed. But then, the details had started to surface, unsettling in their precision, their irrefutable accuracy. Alicia Pearson. Her name, a whisper at first, now a roar in his ears. He remembered the incident with her brother, Dorian. A blur of adrenaline and frustration. He'd justified it then, as he always did, maintaining order, protecting the city. Now, the memory played back, stripped of its self-serving justifications, revealing the ugly truth of unchecked power. He could almost hear Celeste's voice, calm and precise, dissecting his actions, exposing the rot beneath the veneer of authority. "She's got nothing," Mark said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. He could feel the walls closing in, the weight of his past sins pressing down, suffocating him. Stokes laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Yeah, right. Nothing but a mountain of phone camera videos, eyewitnesses, and a timeline that matches her brother's injuries down to the minute." He turned, his eyes meeting Mark's, a spark of genuine panic flickering within their depths. "This isn't like the other times, Mark. This is different. Different." The word reverberated in Mark's mind. This time there was no easy fix, no convenient scapegoat. Alicia Pearson wasn't going away. And now, with Celeste Jameson at her side, the whispers of discontent were becoming a chorus, a symphony of accusations echoing through the halls of power. The air in City Hall was different, sterile, permeated with the hushed whispers of power and influence. He hated being here, exposed, vulnerable. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a relentless, irritating drone. He saw Alicia Pearson sitting on a bench outside the hearing room, her posture rigid, her face a mask of quiet determination. He could feel her gaze burning into him, a tangible accusation. She was a constant reminder of his crumbling world. Beside her sat Dorian, silent and withdrawn, his mere presence a stark condemnation. Inside, the hearing was a blur of legalese and procedural maneuvering. Mark listened, or rather, he pretended to listen, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of denial and fear. Celeste Jameson's voice cut through the fog, sharp and precise. He watched her, a grudging respect warring with his mounting terror. She moved with a quiet confidence, a predator circling its prey. A woman who refused to back down. She had receipts, cell phone records. She showed up at City Hall. She wouldn't let it go. The words hung in the air, a testament to Alicia's unwavering resolve. It was Renee Alston's testimony that truly shattered the illusion of control. Her voice, trembling at first, gained strength as she recounted the incidents she'd witnessed, the casual brutality, the deliberate cover-ups. Mark felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He'd underestimated her, dismissed her as a naive rookie. Now, she was the instrument of his downfall. Luis Benvides followed, his testimony a methodical dismantling of the systemic rot within the MPD. He spoke of internal complaints filed and ignored, of retaliation swift and brutal. Mark watched Judge Harville, the initial indifference on his face slowly replaced by a grim understanding. He knew then, with a chilling certainty, that it was over. The game was up. The final blow came unexpectedly. A new name, a new face. Kendrick Solomon. He walked to the stand, his eyes meeting Mark's with a mixture of pain and defiance. He recounted his own ordeal, his voice raw with emotion. His story, mirroring Dorian's, painted a damning picture of a pattern of abuse, of a system designed to protect the perpetrators and silence the victims. The shift in power was palpable, a seismic tremor that shook the very foundations of the courtroom. Mark felt it in the sudden hush, in the weight of the judge's gaze, in the unwavering stare of Alicia Pearson. The fear, once a dull ache, now blossomed into a full-blown panic, cold and suffocating. He looked at Stokes, his former partner, his co-conspirator. Stokes avoided his gaze, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. The silence stretched, heavy and pregnant with unspoken accusations. In that silence, Mark Callahan finally understood. He wasn't untouchable. He was broken, and he was alone. The stale air of the precinct locker room hung heavy, thick with the scent of sweat, cheap cologne, and a faint metallic tang. Mark Callahan slammed his locker shut, the clang echoing through the otherwise quiet space. A tremor of unease, a low hum of anxiety, vibrated beneath his skin. It was a feeling he wasn't used to, a feeling that didn't belong in this space, his space. He'd ruled these hallways for years, his badge a shield, his authority unquestioned. But lately, the air had shifted. Whispers followed him like shadows, sidelong glances replacing the usual backslapping camaraderie. "Guess who's back in the news again?" Officer Miller's voice, laced with a strange mixture of amusement and apprehension, drifted from a cluster of officers huddled by the notice board. Sister of assault victim files federal civil rights lawsuit against MPD. Mark stiffened. Assault victim. The words pricked at his conscience, a dull ache he quickly suppressed. He knew exactly which victim Miller was referring to. He remembered the night, the adrenaline, the sickening crunch of bone against asphalt. He justified it then, rationalized it as necessary force. But the memory, once conveniently buried, now clawed at the edges of his mind, a persistent ghost refusing to be silenced. "Serves them right," Stokes' gruff voice cut through the locker room, dispelling the momentary quiet. Always playing the victim card. Mark glanced at his partner, a flicker of relief washing over him. Stokes, at least, remained steadfast, unyielding, an anchor in the rising tide of doubt. He tried to shake off the unease, to recapture the sense of invincibility he'd always possessed. But the feeling persisted, a nagging itch beneath his skin. He walked out of the locker room, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against his back. At home, the unease followed him. It coiled in his gut as he scrolled through emails, the blue light of the screen painting his face in an eerie glow. Then he saw it, an email from a name he hadn't seen in years. Celeste Jameson, a lawyer. Sharp, meticulous, relentless. She'd investigated a complaint against him years ago, a minor incident he'd managed to brush aside. But the memory of her sharp gaze, the way she dissected his every word, still sent a chill down his spine. The email was brief, professional, yet laced with a subtle undercurrent of warning. Personnel review inquiry. Officer Mark Callahan, you'll be hearing from me soon. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He reread the email, each word a hammer blow against his carefully constructed facade of indifference. Hearing from her? What did she possibly want? The old case was closed, buried, wasn't it? A wave of nausea swept over him, a cold dread settling in his bones. He tried to dismiss it, to tell himself it was nothing. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing, twisting its roots around his heart, squeezing the air from his lungs. He paced the room, his mind a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts. He needed a drink, something strong, something to numb the gnawing fear. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of apprehension and forced normalcy. The whispers at the precinct intensified, the sidelong glances becoming more pointed. The weight of unspoken accusations pressed down on him, suffocating him. He could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet, the foundation of his carefully constructed life beginning to crack. Then came the memo, a single sheet of paper pinned to the notice board, its stark white surface screaming against the dull beige of the wall. It announced, in crisp, official font, that Celeste Jameson had assumed full authority over the internal affairs investigation into alleged misconduct within the 3rd Precinct. The locker room fell silent. The air thickened, charged with a palpable tension. Mark stared at the memo, his breath caught in his throat. Celeste Jameson. Here. Now. It was no longer a vague threat, a distant possibility. It was real, and it was terrifying. He could feel the blood draining from his face, his hands clammy and cold. He looked at Stokes, seeking reassurance, a shared sense of denial. But even Stokes' usual bravado seemed to have faltered. His face was pale, his jaw clenched tight. The silence was broken by a choked laugh, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep within Mark's own chest, a desperate attempt to dispel the fear that was slowly consuming him. But the laugh died in his throat, replaced by a chilling certainty. The walls were closing in, and this time there was nowhere to run. The whispers, the glances, the memo, they were all pieces of a puzzle that was slowly forming a picture of his downfall. He had built his career on intimidation, on bending the rules, on silencing those who dared to challenge him. But now, the silenced voices were finding their strength, and they were coming for him. And Celeste Jameson, with her unwavering gaze and her relentless pursuit of justice, was leading the charge. The stale air of courtroom 4B hung heavy, thick with the hushed anticipation of a packed gallery. Sunlight, fractured by the grime on the high windows, cast long, distorted shadows across the worn wooden benches. Mark Callahan adjusted his tie, the knot feeling suddenly too tight. He could feel the weight of 100 gazes, a palpable pressure against his skin. He shot a glance at Brian Stokes beside him. Stokes' face was a mask of studied indifference, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the empty space where the judge would soon appear. They can't touch us, Callahan told himself, the thought of brittle reassurance against the tremor in his hands. We're Teflon, years of ingrained confidence, the product of a system built to protect its own, fought against the creeping unease that had plagued him since the internal investigation began. This hearing, he'd been assured, was a formality, a slap on the wrist, a show for the public. The rhythmic tap of a heel against the polished floor cut through the courtroom murmur. Every head turned. Callahan's breath hitched. It wasn't the city attorney he'd been expecting. Celeste Jameson. Her presence was a physical blow, the air knocked from his lungs. He hadn't seen her since it had all started. She moved with a quiet authority, her dark hair pulled back, her expression unreadable. A flicker of something, fear? Regret? Crossed Stokes' face, quickly masked by a scowl. What the hell is she doing here? The question hammered in Callahan's mind, a frantic bird against the bars of his carefully constructed composure. All rise. The bailiff's voice boomed, the formality of the courtroom snapping back into place. Judge Harville entered, his face impassive as he settled onto the bench. Callahan forced himself to stand straight, to project an image of calm authority. Inside, though, a cold dread was spreading, a premonition of something about to shatter. The preliminary procedures blurred in Callahan's ears, a meaningless drone against the insistent thrum of his anxiety. He caught snippets of the charges, the standard denials, the veiled accusations from the city attorney, but his focus remained laser-pointed on Celeste. She sat quietly, a still figure amidst the controlled chaos, her gaze fixed on the proceedings with an intensity that made Callahan's skin crawl. He could feel her dissecting him, peeling back the layers of his carefully constructed facade. He felt exposed, vulnerable, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Then it was her turn. She rose, her movement fluid and graceful, and approached the stand. The shift in the courtroom atmosphere was palpable. The hushed whispers ceased. Every eye was on her. For the record, her voice was clear, resonant, cutting through the silence like a blade. I've assumed full authority over the disciplinary review of these two officers. Her gaze swept over Callahan and Stokes, lingering for a beat before returning to the judge. Your Honor, this isn't an isolated incident. This is a pattern of abuse, of racial profiling, of systematic misconduct that has been allowed to fester within the MPD for far too long. Callahan felt a jolt, a visceral reaction to the weight of her words. He opened his mouth to object, to interrupt the steady stream of accusations, but the words caught in his throat. Celeste continued, her voice unwavering as she presented a meticulously crafted narrative of their misconduct. Video footage of unwarranted stops, reports documenting falsified evidence, testimonies from victims recount the fluorescent lights of courtroom 4B hummed, a sterile counterpoint to the storm that had just passed. Mark Callahan felt the weight of the room settle onto him, a suffocating blanket of silence punctuated only by the rustle of papers and hushed whispers. Suspended. The word echoed in the hollow chambers of his mind, a stark contrast to the confident swagger he had worn just hours before. His carefully constructed facade had crumbled, brick by painstaking brick, under the relentless barrage of Celeste Jameson's questions. Each meticulously presented piece of evidence, each carefully chosen word, had chipped away at his defenses, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. He glanced at Brian Stokes, his partner, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with a furious defiance that Callahan knew was a mask for a similar fear. Stokes still clung to the illusion of control, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. Celeste Jameson stood by her table, her posture ramrod straight, a quiet strength radiating from her. She gathered her files, her movements precise and economical, every gesture imbued with a quiet confidence that grated on Callahan's raw nerves. He'd underestimated her. Everyone had. They'd seen a young woman returning to a city that had chewed her up and spat her out, and they'd expected her to break. Instead, she'd returned forged in fire, a weapon honed to a razor's edge. He remembered sneering at her opening remarks, certain that his carefully crafted lies, bolstered by years of ingrained corruption, would prevail. Now the taste of ash filled his mouth. Alicia Pearson sat beside Dorian, her hand resting on his arm. Her face, etched with years of weary struggle, finally held a flicker of something resembling peace. Dorian's presence, his quiet dignity in the face of their brutality, had been a constant reminder of the human cost of their actions, a silent accusation that resonated louder than any shouted protest. Callahan avoided their gaze, unable to bear the weight of their unspoken condemnation. The gavel's sharp crack shattered the tense silence, signaling the end of the hearing. Judge Harville's gaze, once impassive, now held a glint of something Callahan couldn't quite decipher. Disappointment? Disgust? Perhaps a flicker of respect for the woman who had single-handedly exposed the rot that had festered within his courtroom for far too long. Callahan swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat a physical manifestation of his mounting dread. His career, his reputation, everything he'd built lay in ruins. He'd gambled everything on the system protecting him, on the ingrained code of silence that had shielded him for years. He'd lost. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the steps. A crowd had gathered, a sea of faces reflecting a mixture of relief, anger, and a fragile hope. Alicia stood at the top of the steps, flanked by Celeste and Dorian, her voice amplified by a makeshift microphone. The quiet murmur of the crowd hushed as she spoke, her words carrying the weight of years of suppressed pain and the burgeoning promise of a future free from fear. "This is just the beginning," Alicia said, her voice raw with emotion. "This is for my brother, for Kendrick, for everyone who has suffered at the hands of those who swore to protect us." Celeste stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Accountability happened today. Justice is what happens next." The words hung in the air, a stark reminder that the fight was far from over. A sudden commotion rippled through the crowd. A young man, his face etched with a familiar mix of fear and defiance, pushed his way to the front. Kendrick Solomon. Callahan felt a cold dread grip his heart. He hadn't anticipated this. He'd thought Solomon would remain silent, another victim swallowed by the system. Kendrick's voice, though trembling, resonated with a newfound strength. "I'm here," he declared, meeting Celeste's gaze. "I'm ready to testify." Callahan watched as Celeste's face softened, a flicker of something akin to pride crossing her features. He knew then that this wasn't just about him, about Stokes. This was about a system, a culture of impunity that had allowed men like him to operate unchecked for far too long. This was about the countless victims whose voices had been silenced, whose stories had been buried. He'd been a cog in that machine, a willing participant in its brutal efficiency. Now that machine was beginning to dismantle piece by agonizing piece. The crowd erupted in a roar of approval, a wave of sound that washed over Callahan, leaving him feeling exposed and utterly alone. Stokes muttered a curse under his breath, his eyes darting nervously around the crowd. The fear in his eyes mirrored Callahan's own. Later, as Celeste stood alone on the courthouse steps, the last of the crowd dispersing, the weight of the day settled upon her. The adrenaline that had fueled her through the hearing had receded, leaving a quiet exhaustion in its wake. She looked out at the city, at the streets where so many had suffered in silence, and a renewed determination hardened her resolve. The fight for justice was a marathon, not a sprint, and she was prepared to run it. A young woman, her eyes bright with a mixture of hope and trepidation, approached her hesitantly. "What you said earlier," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "About walking, and what did you mean?" Celeste smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed her face. "Don't wait to be allowed in," she repeated, her voice soft but firm. "Walking like the door should have been open all along. It's your right. It's everyone's right." The young woman nodded, her eyes shining with newfound understanding. As she walked away, a sense of quiet satisfaction filled Celeste. This, she realized, was the true measure of victory. Not just the courtroom drama, not just the exposure of corruption, but the empowerment of those who had been silenced for far too long. The seeds of change had been planted, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that they would bloom.